Welcome to semi-futuristic dystopian Chicago, where you better fall in line or else. That's right, folks. We are going over the Divergent series in this video. I really enjoyed this trilogy because it was very simple, and I was reading this around the time of the Hunger Games as well. And it was really popular time for dystopian-oriented stories. But one thing I do like about this book is that it keeps the main character's love life simplified. It's not another one of those love triangles that were happening quite frequently for a while there. Once the main character meets the person that she's like, this is the guy for me, and there ain't nobody else kind of situation. So I really appreciate that. It was a little bit of a breath of fresh air. But anyway. The story takes place in Chicago, or what's left of it, rather. And Chicago is surrounded by a massive electrified fence. And within that wall is five different factions of people. And each faction is based off of different attributes. You have Dauntless, which is kind of like their police force. That's where all the brave people go. And then you have Amity, which are the farmers. And a detail that's kept in the books and not so much in the movies, you get a little bit of a snippet of it, but they're about the only ones allowed to go outside the wall because that's where their farms primarily are. But they're the peaceful, fun-loving folk. And then you have Abnegation, which are the selfless faction, and they are the government of the whole system, and they are very selfless. They help the homeless and needy. We'll get into who they are here in a moment. Then you have Erudite, which is the smart people, and they basically cover all the scientific side of everything. And lastly, you have Candor, and those are the people that tell the truth no matter what, even if you wish they wouldn't. And they basically handle the court system, if you will. They look at truth as quite simply black and white with no gray area in between. So, where this story starts, you meet the character Beatrice Pryor, and she is among the Abnegation faction. And she's coming of age, and she's getting to the point where she's getting to the end of her main schooling, and she's about to participate in a ceremony where you choose either to remain with the faction you're already in or to move on to a different one. And as we progress through the trilogy, you'll understand why certain people have an easier time selecting their faction than others. But we'll get into that later. So, Triss is obviously, grappling with growing up and deciding whether or not she wants to stay with her family or go with where her heart truly sits. And things really take a turning point when she sits in for an aptitude test. And it's basically a simulation that everybody is put through where this nanotech serum is injected into their body, and it basically causes them to hallucinate. But you have a test proctor that is kind of guiding the simulation to figure out where her aptitude lies. In other words, which faction does your aptitude lie in? But the twist with Beatrice is that when the test is supposed to yield only one result, you're only supposed to belong in one place. But when she takes her test, much to the dismay of the proctor and herself, she comes back with three total results. I believe it was Abnegation, Dauntless, and Erudite, possibly. And that may not seem like a bad thing, but the problem is that means she is a thing called Divergent, meaning she belongs to multiple factions, and that's a problem because that interrupts the system, if you will. And those that are in power don't like anything that upsets their order, if you will. So she has to not only deal with the new challenges of whatever faction she chooses, she also has to deal with the challenges of hiding the fact that she is divergent as well, while passing the unique challenges of her faction. And by the end of it, you have an all out conflict among factions, and I won't spoil who is the driving force behind this conflict, because you'll grow to hate her character just as much as I did as being the main villain for at least the first and second book. But at the end of the story, you have a lot of major several character deaths, and it really, really is gut wrenching to go through all that. But that's how I'll leave it at that with this story so you guys can experience it the same way I did. That'll move on to the second book in the series, Insurgent. And I'll tell you what, I am a sucker for gorgeous book covers. Like, that is some really neat design right there. And I love how you have some a little bit of art in the bottom part of these first two books that show Chicago in its ruined state, what's left of it, like I mentioned. You got five factions in there trying to do the best that they can. Speaking of which, there isn't a sixth group of people that I meant to mention earlier who are called factionless. And those are people that didn't belong in any faction or they failed the test of the factions they chose and were pretty much booted out. So that's your homeless population that abnegation is pretty much trying to help support because they're the selfless ones. Now, Insurgent was my favorite book in the trilogy, much like that of the Hunger Games series. I felt like it had the most put into it, the most twists and turns, the most shocking things. But, you're still reeling from the events of the first book. This book picks up almost immediately where the first book ends. Like, there's no time passage hardly at all. It just drops right back into where you left the characters, and they're pretty much on the run at this point, trying to survive and figure out how they're going to take down the big bad in this one. And by the end of the story, like, the stakes are really high, and I won't spoil what those stakes are, but you have a race against time where Triss is trying to get to the main bad before something really bad happens. And you get to see, speaking of, one thing the book did that the books don't do, there was no puzzle solving box with simulations that Triss had to go to. There were challenges similar to it that she had to grapple, like fighting herself, but I won't get into that. That's a whole other deal. You also learn that there are apparently different serums that have different functions that are associated with different factions. So, like, abnegation has a serum that I can't remember what it makes you do, but candor has a serum that makes you tell the truth no matter what, and only divergents seem to have resistance to these serums. And so, see, there again, you have the problem of divergence not falling in line with their system, and people don't like that. But they're just trying to fight for their own freedom at this point. But Erudite has a serum that allows them to control people who aren't divergent. Like, it just goes on and on, but more on that later. So, hopping into the third one here, you have Allegiant. And out of the major twists and turns of the second book, in the third book, we now find ourselves going outside of the wall for the first time and investigating the world beyond. Because by the end of the second book here, we see this recording that sheds some light on some things, and we learn that the people of Chicago are not the last people on the planet like it was once thought. And what we do find out is that the world outside of Chicago is in a ruined state due to a past war. But it's in this book that you learn why the faction system in Chicago exists and why it worked so well for the longest time before all the divergents started showing up. And we find ourselves in a new location, this airport that has been remade into this government agency of genetic research. And you can even see that in the bottom of the book cover here, the airport in the bottom there instead of Chicago. And basically, you have to, first of all, the story does like a complete like 90-degree turn. You had this main bad that you were up against in the first two books, and now in this book you have more of a 180, I should say, where you're dealing with a completely different big bad. And it just takes the story into a whole new completely different turn. And one thing I will say, as far as the book to movie adaptation, it was a major missed opportunity or bad decision on the movie maker's part, because Honestly, it looks like that they were trying to imitate the same thing that Harry Potter did and that the Hunger Games did. Remember in an older video, I said the Hunger Games made splitting the last one into two parts work. But this one right here is a shining example of why you shouldn't split the last one into two parts. There was not enough material in there to do so to begin with. And on top of that, when they did the part one of this movie called Allegiance, the second one was going to be called Ascendant, but it never happened. They changed the storyline up just enough to take it a different direction, and it ended up just messing everything up, and it honestly undercut the actual story itself of the third book. And it's almost like they had intentions of going a certain direction after that, but there again, the third movie was done so poorly that it just didn't end well for them. And it honestly felt like they made the genetic government agency more futuristic than how it was depicted in the book. And honestly, like the architecture of the place in the movie felt so whimsical. It kind of took you out of the realism of it a little bit. Like it honestly reminded me of some of the architecture you see in the early Spy Kids movies, and it just didn't match what the story was supposed to be. But all in all, this was still a pretty good book. A little bit slower, in my opinion, than the first two books, but still a pretty good read. And I will go ahead and say that I don't consider this to be a happy ending, which I think is another good thing about the book. It kind of takes a different turn for our main characters and all that. So that there's a lot of things that this series did that I appreciate that other series are a little afraid to do. So I'll move on to that. There's one more book to review here, and it's one called Four. Now, if I remember correctly, Veronica Roth, the author of these books, originally intended to write the story from the first person point of view of the character named Four, or Tobias Eaton. And after getting partway through it, she decided to do it from the point of view of Tris Pryor instead. And I guess she just felt it worked a little better going that direction. So really, all that the book four does is kind of give you parts of the Divergent book story from Four's point of view, of course, but it also gives you more of his backstory when he was in a faction before the one that he chose to be in. And it also just shows what led him to decide to choose the faction that he eventually went into and some of the hardships that he endured along with it. But you get to learn all about that in the main trilogy as well. So you don't have to read this one, but it's still a pretty good read, in my opinion. So that covers this book for today and this whole entire series. I hope you guys seriously check it out because I honestly did enjoy these books, especially the first two, the second one in particular. But yeah, y'all have a good day.